Chords can be formed in three ways: a combination of notes within the harmony layer, a combination of notes within the melody layer. Usually chords in the melody layer result from planing, that is, lines moving mostly in parallel with the melody. The combination of a harmonic frame within the harmony layer, usually a perfect fifth, with a melodic frame in the melody layer, usually a perfect fourth, tritone, or perfect fifth. Chords are generally built on a stable structural perfect fifth, which establishes its lowest note as the root. The perfect fifth frame may be filled in various ways. Relatively consonant fills include a minor or major third, creating a minor or major triad, 037 or 047, or a major second, creating a more open fourth dominated chord, 027 or 057. The fifth alone, or these relatively consonant fills, often attract dissonant distractors, notes that lie a semitone above or below one of the relatively stable notes. Very often, these chords are voiced with a dissonant distractor in the bass or soprano. Such voicings produce a vertical combination of tritone and perfect fourth that is such an evident sonic feature of the music, 5+6 or 6+5. Other ways of filling and framing perfect fifths are also in common use, especially 0-3-4-7, a simultaneous combination of major and minor triads that share a root. Despite their intervallic variety, these chords have a shared consonant basis in the framing fifth with a determinate root. Here we see the first and last chords in the ballet. Both are built on a perfect fifth, 0-7, which is filled in with a whole tone, 0-2-7. To this consonant frame, a dissonant semitone distractor is added, either below or above the fifth of the chord. Thinking about the chords as related by intervallic voice leading, the G-sharp A remains the same, while the C-sharp D-sharp moves up a semitone to D-E. The root progression is from C-sharp, the central pitch of the opening measures, to D, the central pitch of the whole of part 2. Here are two chords from the introduction to part 1 that are built on the perfect fifth EB. After its C-sharp centered opening, the introduction to part 1 features two extended C-centered, E-centered moments oriented toward these chords. In the subsequent scene, Augurs of Spring, the E emerges as a principal foil for and distractor of the more stable E-flat, B-flat frame that dominates the scene. This is the famous Augurs chord, the pounding dissonant chord that sounds throughout the first half of the Augurs of Spring. Most obviously, it is a combination of two triads, E major below and E-flat major, actually E-flat 7, above, each with its own root and fifth frame. I'll discuss it from that vantage point later. But here I note its affinities with a more common type of chord in this ballet, triad with dissonant distractor a semitone above the root, and voiced with the distractor in the bass. That voicing gives us the familiar 6+5=11 registral arrangement. This interpretation affirms the E-flat centeredness of the chord, which is the basis for the E-flat orientation of the entire scene. This repeated cadential chord is centered on F and the perfect fifth FC. That fifth is filled in as a minor major triad, 0-3-7, 0-4-7, and with a dissonant distractor, G-flat, added a semitone above the root, as well as a major seventh, E, added a semitone below the root. The chord affirms the F-centricity of the entire ritual of abduction. In this passage from the beginning of the introduction to part 2, The first chord is D minor with dissonant distractor D sharp, which gets its own triad in support. In its juxtaposition of triads whose roots are a semitone apart, this chord bears an obvious affinity with the augurs chord. The second chord is oriented toward EB, filled in as simultaneous major and minor triads. Motion from D to E is a recurrent feature of the introduction to Part 2 and the sacrificial dance, where an extended version of this progression returns. The larger progression by whole step from D to E mirrors the more rapid whole step alternation of minor triads on D sharp and C sharp, as well as the host of stuttering melodies and oscillating harmonies throughout the rite. The rite's melodies are often amplified by planing. Additional melodic lines track the main melody in rhythmic homophony with mostly parallel motion. Planing takes different forms. It may be tonal, with the parallelism adjusted to a prevailing diatonic environment, or real. The parallel intervals are all of the same size and quality. It may involve a single line, or full triads or seventh chords. It may also involve more dissonant combinations and motion that is nearly, but not uniformly, parallel. This is the Spring Rounds procession melody as it is first heard within Augurs of Spring. It moves within a B-flat, E-flat frame and is harmonized via planing 6/5 chords, all drawn from the E-flat Dorian collection. I think of the chords as triads with an added sixth, with each melody note as the triad root. In that sense, the progression ascends from a chord on B-flat, harmonizing B-flat, to a chord on E-flat, harmonizing E-flat. The E-flat chord is the principal chord in the progression. This melody, the abduction fanfare, moves within a perfect fifth frame, E-flat, B-flat. Its planing accompaniment consists of two streams of thirds, a minor third always combined with a major third, and the two thirds share a common tone. Each chord is thus a dissonant 014 or 034. The chord that harmonizes E-flat is the principal chord of the progression. Rooted on C with both major and minor thirds, the fifth is implied, not present. The simultaneous presence of C-oriented music and E-flat-oriented music is typical of both augurs and abduction. Beneath the Spring Rounds procession melody, we hear a subordinate melody descend from B-flat to E. This subordinate melody is encrusted with dissonant planing. Each chord is a major triad in 6/3 position, with a distractor 11 semitones below the root. Beneath the DCG melody, we hear mostly parallel planing. The first and last chords are T7-related forms of 0147, understood here as major triads with a semitone distractor. The final chord, E-flat major with E natural distractor, recalls the augurs chord. This melody is a compressed version of what will later turn out to be the main tune of Mystic Circle. All 5 chords can be thought of as triads with a distractor. The melody note, the highest note, is always the root of the triad. The distractor is almost always the lowest sounding note. The whole step oscillation of chords 1 and 2 tracks the whole step oscillation of B-flat and A-flat in the melody, one of the many such stutter figures in the ballet. Chord 1 is the principal chord, enforcing a sense of B-flat centricity on the passage. The Mystic Circle melody is one of the most song-like melodies in the ballet and one of the few passages with a key signature, here B major. From the first chord to the last, we find another whole tone oscillation, from a chord on B F sharp to a chord on A E, each filled in as a triad with distractors. This is the moment when the chosen one is chosen. The Mystic Circle melody is here reduced to a simple alternation of its last two notes, D sharp and C sharp. The planing accompaniment provides an alternation or oscillation of two chords, G sharp minor with distractor A, and F sharp minor with distractor G sharp. In both chords, the distractor is in the bass, a harmonic oscillation in support of a melodic whole tone stutter. This 11-chord progression involves only 4 different chords. In this dissonant planing, the lower voice follows the melody in parallel 11s. The middle voice jumps around to produce 6 plus 5 or 5 plus 6 on every beat. If we focus in on the first chord, we see that it is built on a perfect fifth, B flat F, with B flat as root. The dissonant distractor, C flat, is in the bass. B flat is both the root of this chord and the centric tone for this section of the naming and honoring of the chosen one. Within both the harmony and melody layers, then, we find a particular type of chord oriented toward a generating root, supported by a consonant perfect fifth, and encrusted with dissonant semitone distractors. What sorts of harmonies are formed between the harmony and melody layers? In the most common situation, both harmony and melody are framed by a perfect fifth. In the harmony layer, a chord framed by a perfect fifth, filled in various ways, and a tune in the melody layer that is either also framed by a perfect fifth or has a frame that inverts a perfect fifth into a perfect fourth. The distance between the harmonic frame and the melodic frame, a normal fifth or an inverted fifth, can be measured in semitones between the structural fifths. They might be separated by 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 semitones, 7 possible arrangements. The movement from arrangement to arrangement can be tracked via intervallic voice leading as the structural frames move up or down by certain distances. Very near the opening of the ballet, we hear 2 different melodies and a single sustained harmony. The first melody, framed by the perfect fourth AD, suggests a peaceful pastoral mood with its lyrical song-like quality. The second melody, framed by the perfect fifth C sharp G sharp, maintains that mood with an evocative sound of nature. The harmonic frame, the perfect fifth C sharp G sharp, coincides with the second melody but clashes sharply with the first. They are a semitone apart at T1. The overall mood is pastoral, but this bucolic place is troubled right from the beginning. The combination of E-flat-oriented melodies and harmonies with C-oriented melodies and harmonies is characteristic of the Augurs of Spring. These structural fifths are related to T3, a milder and more consonant combination than the semitone of the previous scene. Compared to the previous scene, the semitone-related fifths, C sharp, G sharp, and DA, have expanded outward to the minor third-related fifths of this scene, C, G, and E-flat, B-flat. Here's the whole passage. And here are its components oriented toward either C or E flat. Here are two moments from the ritual of abduction. In the first, the abduction hunting call on AD is harmonized by F7. The two structural fifths are related to T3, like the fifths in augurs. The music at the end of the scene has FC in the harmony and B flat, E flat at the top of the melody. Compared to the hunting call, the harmony stays the same while the melody shifts up a semitone. The close intervallic voice leading binds these musical moments together. The abduction fanfare returns, now transposed to CG. It is in agreement with the harmony, a dissonant chord rooted on CG. In general, moments of coincidence between melody and harmony are relatively consonant and pastoral in feeling. This, however, is a violent exception to that general principle. The second tribe's fanfare has a melody on AD and a harmony on F sharp C sharp, related by T4. The second tribe's fanfare, loud, militaristic, male, has strong thematic and affective links with the abduction hunting call and the abduction fanfare. The combination of structural fifths on C and E flat looks back to augurs, but there it was E flat in the harmony and C in the melody. Here it is the reverse. In two occurrences, the mystic circle melody takes a harmony at the same pitch level. The harmonious relationship between melody and harmony is emblematic of the feminized pastoral mode. The melody, the mystic circle procession, is an open perfect fifth, not filled in. The harmony is a whole tone alternation, C sharp and E flat, related to other whole tone alternations and trills in this scene and throughout the ballet. I take it as the lower component of an implied 027 within a perfect fifth, C sharp, G sharp. It thus evokes the sound of the opening of the ballet in a similarly pastoral moment. The mystic circle procession is also closely linked to the mystic circle first theme as it appeared in the introduction to Part 2. The naming and honoring melody is an incomplete Dorian tetrachord, B flat C, D flat, E flat. The bass note F, embellished by chromatic upper and lower neighbors, acts as the root of an implied FC fifth. This particular combination refers back to abduction, another scene of men's violent triumph over women. In its juxtaposition of C G and E flat B flat, this passage, the women's chant, refers back to many moments in Part 1, including especially the Augurs of Spring. As the rite draws toward its shattering conclusion, references to the opening scenes of the ballet intensify. Both of these exotic-sounding serpentine tunes center on A flat and move within an implied A flat E flat frame. The marching harmony, a religious procession, is oriented toward B flat F. When the tunes fall within a tritone frame, the harmonic models have to be extended to include combinations of O7 in the harmony and O6 in the melody. Such combinations are very often arranged to feature a 5+6 or 6+5 disposition. For example, the Old Woman's melody is first heard within a tritone frame F sharp C, harmonized by C sharp G sharp. The combined frame of tritone plus perfect fifth is arranged to feature, reading from the top down, 6 semitones above F sharp, which is 5 semitones above C. At the end of Part 1, the Wild Dance of the Earth features a melody that moves within a tritone frame D G sharp. It is heard in relation to loud punctuating chords centered on C G. The combination of melodic and harmonic frames again produces 5+6 registrally. At the end of Part 2, the even wilder sacrificial dance features a melody, I'm calling it the Final Judgment, that moves within a different tritone frame A flat D above an ostinato centered on E flat B flat. Again, the combined frame gives rise to a 5+6 registral arrangement. These three moments are bound together by their shared combination of a tritone-framed melody with a perfect fifth-framed harmony, and by the 5+6 registral arrangement they all project. Looking at the intervallic voice leading that links them, we see that the music at the end of the ballet is a simple transposition of the opening music up 2 semitones. All three moments, despite the obvious differences, are concerned dramatically with something inhuman, possibly supernatural, possibly subhuman, the old woman, a diviner, half woman, half beast, the wild dance of life that ends Part 1, the even wilder dance of death that ends Part 2. Taking harmony and melody together, the music is often oriented toward three familiar referential collections: the diatonic collection, the octatonic collection, and the whole tone collection. These collections are associated with the different transpositional relationships between melodic and harmonic frames. The diatonic is associated with T0, T2, and T5, the octatonic with T3 and T6, and with the various combinations of perfect fifths and tritones, the whole tone with T2, T4, T6, and with various combinations of perfect fifths and tritones. These collections are associated also with the four principal melody types. 0257 melodies are diatonic, 0235 melodies are diatonic or octatonic, 0336 melodies are octatonic, and 0246 melodies are whole tone. These collections rarely occur in a pure form in the music, with all notes present and without extraneous notes. It is perhaps better to think of them as colors or tendencies or sound worlds. It is possible to imagine that each scale is associated with particular sorts of musical meanings. The diatonic scale, including 0235 melodies, is associated with human characters, the young men and young women, and with the pastoral and military modes. The octatonic scale, including 0235 and 0336 melodies, is associated with superhuman characters, the old woman who was a diviner, the sage, the elders, and the ancestors. The whole tone scale, including 0246 melodies and framing fifths related by T2, T4, or T6, is associated with the subhuman, the animalistic, in the form either of orgiastic dances of life or wild dances of death. These associations are far from universal in the rite, but they do operate as general tendencies. This is the young women's melody. The passage comes shortly after their entry on stage. The prevailing collection is E-flat Dorian. It's purely diatonic. Melody and harmony inhabit the same structural fifth, E-flat, B-flat. This is a harmonious, relatively consonant passage, expressive of the feminized and peaceful pastoral. This is another purely diatonic passage, this time F Aeolian. The structural fifths are related to T5, an arrangement that is often associated with the diatonic and with the peaceful, feminized pastoral. The abduction fanfare melody, a celebration of male violence, a decidedly non-pastoral moment, yet also purely diatonic, this time F mixolydian. The old woman's melody, she is a superhuman character, a diviner of indeterminate age, presented in a mostly octatonic context. The elders and ancestors pronounce their sentence of doom. The strands start to pile up, I call that formal accumulation, as we approach the shattering climax of this scene. 3 melodic or harmonic frames related by T3 or T6. This is a clearly octatonic orientation. An orgiastic dance of life. An ostinato that traverses a whole tone scale upward from C, either in halves or in its entirety, moves through the entire scene. Here, it is heard with a whole tone melody D, E, F sharp, G sharp, as well as a repeated chord C, D, F sharp, G. The melodic and harmonic frames together adjoin distractors D and G sharp to the centric CG. a demonic dance of death. Over a harmonic ostinato on E flat, the ancestors, many dressed in bearskins, passed their final judgment on the chosen one with a whole tone melody, A flat, B flat, C, D, 0246. The music of the Rite of Spring is not in a key in any traditional sense, but individual blocks, larger sections comprising several blocks, and even entire scenes are oriented towards centric tones and the harmonies that arise from them. In some cases, although without systematic consistency, pitch centers are associated with particular dramatic situations or expressive impacts. For example, F-centered passages are often energetic and celebratory. B-centered passages are often quiet, lyrical, and gentle, coded female. A-centered passages are often violent and wild. E-flat in part 1 and D in part 2 are particularly common pitch centers, not so much with a particular effective impact, but rather as the harmonic ground on which one can trace a narrative of evolving expressive modes. Whatever the pitch center, the descending semitone between adjacent centers may convey a sense of fatality. The Augurs of Spring is mostly oriented toward E flat, as first the men and then the women dance separately. At the end of the scene, the focus shifts to F as the men and women come together for a raucous, joyous celebration. The same movement from E flat to F, and with similar dramatic significance, characterizes the next scene, the ritual of abduction. At the beginning of that scene, the men chase, pursue, hunt, and capture the women, and E flat centered harmonies are prominent. At the end of the scene, the men celebrate their triumph on F. The men's triumph at the end of the ritual of abduction leads directly to this quiet, pastoral, mournful response from the women. The shared orientation toward F, amid trills on E flat, heightens the radical expressive contrast. F resumes its more common role toward the end of part 2, when the chosen one has been selected and is motionless at the center of the stage. The other women circle her and perform a celebratory F-centered dance. In contrast to the celebratory triumphant F, B-centered moments tend to be gentler, quieter, explicitly associated with the female dancers and with the feminine. This here is the feminine second theme in rival tribes, associated with the female dancers as they flirt with the men and try to divert them from their warlike games. I call it the women's entreaty. In part 2, the young women dance their mysterious circle dance on B, gentle, lyrical, mostly consonant. There are very few moments in the ballet that are A-centered, but the two most prominent A-centered passages are strongly associated thematically and dramatically: the outer sections of the naming and honoring of the chosen one, and the final section of the chosen one's own sacrificial dance. Here, the chosen one stands motionless at the center of a circle, while the young women dance wildly, exultantly around her as the note A pounds away in the bass. The chosen one's final moments, the concluding measures of the sacrificial dance right before the final cadence which marks her death. Timpani and basses assert A and C repeatedly. These violent A-centered moments distantly recall the opening folk melody of the ballet, whose expressive impact they demonically invert, from a quiet feminized pastoral to a violent danse macabre. There are numerous passages, especially in Part 1, that focus on E flat, especially with a strong admixture of C. It is hard to generalize about the affective qualities of this harmony or this harmonic combination. Indeed, it seems to function as a somewhat neutral harmonic ground on which the full range of expressive modes play out, emphasizing the affective contrast by means of the harmonic continuity. We can say, however, that Part 1 is bracketed with extended E-flat centered passages. In the Augurs of Spring, the first scene after the curtain goes up, the men's melody, as they learn divination from the old woman, is centered on C-G, accompanied by harmonies on both C and E-flat. The fanfare chords lend a sense of masculinized expressive mode. A bit later in the same scene, the young women enter, and their soft lyrical melody, similarly centered on C-G, is similarly accompanied by harmonies on C and E-flat. In the subsequent scene, the ritual of abduction, the expressive mode has changed dramatically, and we find ourselves in a wild, violent, celebratory dance of men's triumph over women. There is no melody yet, but the persistent harmony is a combination of C7 with E-flat 7. In the scene that follows, the spring rounds, the dramatic situation has changed yet again. This is a sort of funeral march in a hymn-like religious mode. Both the harmony and melody are centered on E-flat, B-flat, with no admixture of C, a sort of funeral march in a hymn-like religious mode. The final scene in Part 1 is the Dance of the Earth, a wild, orgiastic dance of life. The melody is centered on E-flat, B-flat, above big, dissonant, C-oriented chords. Part 1 is thus mostly E-flat oriented, bracketed by scenes that conjoin a basic orientation toward E-flat with a persistent presence of C. For both of these scenes, the focus on E-flat and C is preceded by a contrasting focus on C-sharp and D. This reinforces a sense of rotational cyclicity in Part 1. It ends harmonically as it begins, and affirms E-flat as a global tonic for Part 1. In contrast, Part 2 is oriented towards D as its global tonic and bracketed by D-centered scenes. Part 2 begins with a slow, quiet, mysterious night music. The harmony is oriented toward D minor, but clouded by repeated E-flat minor triads. The sacrificial dance at the end of Part 2, and of course the end of the entire ballet, is in a radically different expressive mode compared to the introduction to Part 2, from mysterious, feminized night music to a violent, murderous, frenzied dance of death. But the music is again oriented toward D, and again we find that D is sometimes clouded by E-flat. We can thus imagine the entire ballet as describing a large descending semitone from E-flat centered Part 1 to D-flat centered Part 2. This large descending semitone at the highest level of structure resonates with the same musical idea expressed over shorter spans. The very first melodic interval of the ballet in the opening folk tune is a descending semitone. Over the course of the introduction to Part 1, that descending semitone CB is composed out in the transposition of the folk tune. Do these descending semitones accrue some of the traditional affective association with death, grief, and lament? I think they do. They also mark out the endpoints of a spiritual and affective journey within each of the two parts of the ballet, from a feminized pastoral through masculinized military and religious modes to a culminating wild dance, and from the dance of life that concludes Part 1 to the dance of death that concludes Part 2.